You know, as you grow older, the days begin to look strangely alike. You wake up and it is the same sounds again. The kitchen, the old kettle rattling as if it holds a grudge against the whole world. The radio that sometimes catches music and sometimes only hisses like a dissatisfied cat. I have lived alone for many years now. The children flew off to their own countries, made their own families, and that is as it should be. Grandchildren are like migrating birds. They arrive in a rush, fill the house with noise, leave behind the smell of cookies and laughter, and then they fly away again. I do not complain. At a certain age, you grow used to silence. At first, it presses on your chest. Then, little by little, it becomes something like an old neighbor. Not exactly a friend, but tolerable. And then, on one of those ordinary days, with no sign that it would be any different, there was an envelope in the mailbox. Yellowed, slightly crumpled, a foreign postmark on the corner. At first, I thought it had to be some mistake, until I saw my name, written carefully, in a familiar hand, a hand I had not seen in more than 50 years. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, turning that envelope over in my hands. The tea went cold. The radio gave one last rustle and fell quiet on its own. And still I could not bring myself to open it, because opening it meant letting an entire century of the past walk into my home. But old age is sly that way. It has plenty of time. So I set the envelope aside, and yet my thoughts had already gone where I had once been young. Her name was Anna. A simple name, isn't it? There are thousands of Annas in the world. But to me, back then, there was only one. I was 17. She was 16. We lived in a small town by the sea, the sort of town where everyone knows everyone, where news travels faster than the wind, and a stranger's face is remembered for years. The sea there was not postcard beautiful. It was gray, sometimes harsh, sometimes gentle like a tired man. We used to meet by an old wooden pier. It creaked under our feet as if complaining about the young, but it held firm, honest as an old soldier. Anna always arrived before I did. She would pretend to be reading a book, but the moment she heard my footsteps, she would look up and smile. You know, there are smiles that make the whole world feel half a shade warmer. Hers was one of those. I remember her headscarf, blue, with a tiny white pattern on it. I remember the wind always trying to tug it loose, and the way Anna would smooth her hair back and scold the wind under her breath. Back then, I believe we had an endless number of days ahead of us, that we would have time for everything, to leave, to study, to return, to leave again, to begin 100 things and change our minds 100 times more. Our dreams were simple. I wanted to go to sea. Not a fairy tale sea, no, a real one, with rust along the railings, a heavy diesel engine, and the smell of salt soaked into your clothes. Anna wanted to become a teacher, not a famous one, not some celebrated figure, just the kind of teacher whose students are no longer afraid to ask questions. And when she spoke about it, her eyes would shine, because she wanted to explain difficult things in simple words. There was one day I can still hear, even now, if I close my eyes. The wind coming off the sea was sharp, though it was summer. The waves were low and heavy. In the harbor, the masts rang softly against one another. Anna came without a book. That alone was strange. She stopped by the railing of the pier and did not look at me right away. I remember her voice, quiet but steady. "We are leaving," she said. After that, time seemed to split itself into before and after. Anna's father had been offered work abroad, another language, another shore, another sea. The train was leaving in a week, not in a month, not someday, in 7 days. A ridiculous amount of time in which to say goodbye to an entire life. I did not know what to say. In books, at moments like that, people speak in grand sentences. They make vows. They argue with fate. I only stood there, feeling my fists tighten, and repeated, almost like a prayer, "Write to me. Just don't disappear. All right. She nodded and tears ran down her face, quiet and stubborn, like rain that will fall no matter how badly you wish it would not. We stood on the platform when it was finally time. The train snorted steam like an irritated beast. People bustled about with bags and suitcases. Anna held a small blue address book in her hands, and inside it she had written my address in neat, careful letters. And just before the train door closed, she said the last thing I would hear from her for many years. Do not forget me, even if we cannot write, as if she already knew that not everything would be in our hands. At first, we wrote often. Thick paper, clumsy pens, ink smudged by hurried fingers. Those letters were our bridge across thousands of miles. She wrote about the new city, the narrow streets, the unfamiliar language, shop windows full of things that all seemed out of reach. She wrote that she missed our gray sea because at least she understood its nature, unlike the smiles on the streets of that new place. I answered with no less enthusiasm. I told her about my studies, about nautical school, about strict instructors and shipmates who laughed when they discovered that I read her letters again at night. Every letter from her felt like a small island, a place to step ashore so you would not drown in routine. And then, one letter did not come. At first I thought it was only delayed. Then a second did not come. I kept writing for several more months, stubborn as a man knocking on a locked door because he is certain someone must still be inside. But no answer came. Back then, when we were young, we hardly ever thought about how many accidents can interfere with a life. A lost envelope, a wrong postal code, someone's carelessness, and sometimes someone's will not to deliver, not to pass something on, not to say. A year went by, then another. I stopped writing, but I still kept her address in that little notebook, as if someday it might all align again. Life moved on, work, voyages, familiar faces, new attachments, then marriage, children. But now and then, when I passed the sea or heard a train whistle somewhere in the distance, I would feel a faint, almost physical sense of an empty chair beside me. That place belonged to Anna, to the image of her that remained forever 17. Now let us return to that day in the kitchen. The envelope still lay before me. The postmark was recent. At last I slid a finger beneath the flap and opened it carefully, almost afraid of tearing something important. Inside there was not just one letter. There was a whole small bundle of envelopes tied together with a faded ribbon, and on top of them a sheet of paper in a different hand. Neat, careful, but not hers. Dear Sir, my name is Emily. I am Anna's daughter. My mother passed away not long ago. While sorting through her things, I found a box with letters addressed to you that were never sent. My mother spoke of you often, especially in her later years. She asked that, if possible, I find you and pass these letters on. Please forgive how late this is. You know, there are moments when the silence in a room becomes almost audible. I sat there staring at those lines, at the name I had not spoken aloud for so many years, and suddenly I understood something. A part of my life I had long believed lost had been lying quietly all that time in someone else's cupboard, in a box no one had opened. I opened the first letter. The paper was faintly yellowed, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Alive, as if Anna had written it yesterday. She wrote about the move, about arriving in a foreign country where even the smells were different, about being afraid to speak, because even when the language seems familiar, you still feel like a guest who is not entirely sure he was invited. In another letter, she wrote about waiting for mine. She went to the post office, watching for familiar stamps, hoping. Then my letters stopped coming. She decided it must have been I who had stopped writing. She thought perhaps I had found someone closer, someone who did not live across an ocean. She did not accuse me. She admitted honestly that she, too, had tried to go on living, because youth does not know how to stand still. I read and felt old thoughts answering somewhere deep in my chest. All those years, it seemed, we had lived like two parallel lines, close in memory, but never crossing, while the same warmth still survived in both of us. In one of the later letters, she wrote that she had married. Not quickly, she had hesitated for a long time, as if she were betraying not a man, but some part of herself still tied to those days by the pier. She wrote about her husband, a kind, patient man with whom she managed to build a quiet, honest life. She wrote about her daughter, Emily, born with eyes astonishingly like her own. And then there was one letter that stole the breath from me. She wrote, "Sometimes I go down to the sea. It is a different sea here, but the water is still salty. I sit by the shore and imagine that somewhere very far away, at the other end of the map, you are also sitting by the water. We are no longer those 17-year-olds, but sometimes it seems to me that the conversation between us is still going on, only now without words and without letters." I did not notice when night came. The clock on the wall counted out midnight, and then later hours besides. I kept reading, setting one letter aside, picking up another, and before my eyes a whole other life unfolded, one in which I had not been present, and yet one in which I somehow remained. I never went to bed that night. In the morning, with red eyes and a heavy head, I read Emily's note again. There was a phone number, an address, a country that by modern standards was not so far away. I looked at that number for a long time. When I was young, I would have dialed at once. In old age, a person first spends time convincing himself that he should not trouble anyone, that perhaps it is not the right moment, that perhaps he has misunderstood, that perhaps he should leave the past alone. In the end, I called. A woman's voice answered, calm, attentive. I introduced myself. There was a short silence. Then she said, "I am very glad you called. My mother would have been glad too." A couple of weeks later, I was sitting on an airplane. My knees complained about the whole idea, of course, and my heart reminded me of my age. But inside I felt something else, as if I were reclaiming an unfinished part of my life. Emily was waiting for me in a small cafe. The moment I walked in, I recognized her. Not by the eyes, not by her hairstyle, but by some familiar expression I had once seen reflected in Anna's face. She stood, came toward me and smiled. "You look very much like the man my mother described," she said. To hide my emotion, I muttered. I hope she embellished a little. Youth tends to do that. Emily shook her head. She said you were the first person who ever made her feel brave. Not grown up, not proper, brave. We sat and drank coffee that cooled faster than we could drink it. Emily brought a folder of photographs. In one, Anna was still very young, already in the new city, but wearing the same headscarf. In another, she stood at a blackboard, smiling at her students. In a third, she held little Emily in her arms and looked at her the way people look at a miracle they are afraid to wake. "She often spoke about your pier," Emily said. "We did not have one like that where we lived, but she loved to walk to the sea. She used to say that the sea is the only place where you can speak to the past and not feel foolish." I listened and understood something very simple. I had not been there for Anna through all those decades. I had not remembered her birthdays. I had not helped her through difficult times. But strangely enough, none of that erased the fact that once, in our youth, we had loved each other with great honesty, and that memory, as it turned out, had lived inside her all her life, not as a wound, but as a quiet light in a distant window. The next day, Emily offered to drive me to the sea her mother had loved. We drove mostly in silence. Every bump in the road answered somewhere in my back, but I had the feeling I was doing something deeply right, not from the point of view of logic, but from the point of view of the heart. The sea here was different from the sea of my youth, and yet in the sound of the waves, I still heard a familiar note. We stepped onto the shore. Sand, a few stones, Seagulls that are the same everywhere in the world, insolent, but free. I walked slowly down to the edge of the water. The wind found its way through my coat. It smelled of salt and something else I could not name. My mother used to stand here, Emily said quietly. She would say that somewhere far away, on another shore, someone was also looking out at the sea at that very moment. I think she meant you. I did not answer. When a man has lived a long life, he learns to value silence no less than words. I stood there thinking how strangely life is arranged. Anna and I never met again. There was no scene from a film where two elderly people recognize each other in a crowd, embrace, and live happily ever after. Our roads parted and did not cross again. And yet something else happened, something no less important. She remembered. And so did I. Standing there by a foreign sea, I knew our first love had not vanished without a trace. It had become part of another human life, her family, her daughter, now standing beside me. When I returned home, my old house seemed different, not because the walls had changed color, but because something inside me had quietly settled into its proper place. On the table lay a neat stack of Anna's letters. Beside them, a photograph Emily had given me. Anna in middle age, standing by the sea, her hair a little disordered by the wind. Not the girl from the pier, but still, her. I began to notice that evenings no longer felt quite so empty. The tea still cools too quickly. The radio still hisses. The floorboards in the hallway still creak in that same old place. But now, in that silence, there is another voice as well. Her voice, living on in those letters. Sometimes I sit down in my chair, take one of the letters, and read it slowly, aloud, as though I am telling the story back to myself. And each time I catch myself thinking that somewhere beyond time and distance, there is still a little wooden pier, and on it stand two teenagers, a boy and a girl. They argue, they laugh, they make plans for a future that will never follow the neat lines they imagined, and yet will still become something real. First love rarely becomes the last. Life does not care much for straight lines or tidy endings. But sometimes that is not what matters. Sometimes it is enough to know that for someone, you were that one person remembered all their life with warmth. Not with pain, not with resentment, but with gratitude. Gratitude for the fact that in that distant time, on that old pier, you helped someone believe in themselves, and believe that the world might be kinder than it seemed. And when the house grows very quiet, I sometimes whisper into that silence, Anna, I received your letters. They just arrived a little later than either of us expected. But you know, they still came in time.